There are about 8 billion people alive right now, and the number is so large it has stopped meaning anything at all. So here is one that has not. 1,280. That is not a village or a bad winter or one unlucky tribe. By one reading of the DNA sitting inside your own body, that is how many breeding adults our entire ancestral line was reduced to. And it stayed that way for longer than our species has so far existed. You already have a guess about what nearly finished us. Almost everybody gives the same answer, and it is the one you saw on a documentary. Hold on to it. Because it did not happen. Not probably did not. The thing you are picturing right now is one of the most thoroughly dismantled stories in the study of human origins, and the times we genuinely came close look nothing like it. Some of them left ash, one left a stripe in the ice at both ends of the planet, one left a pit in London packed so tightly with bodies that they had to be stacked. And the closest call of all left nothing. No ash, no ice, no grave, no ruin. Only a gap inside living men that nobody even noticed until the last few years. So how close did we actually come? Start with that number. Because of everything here, it is the hardest to sit with. In 2023, a team of geneticists did something that sounds like it should not work. They did not pick up a shovel. They did not go anywhere near a cave or a dig site or a box of bones in a museum drawer. They used spit. 3,154 people alive today, walking around with jobs and shopping bags. A tube each. And out of those tubes, a machine reading 4 letters over and over billions of times until it had the full text of each of them. Because you are carrying a document right now in every cell in your hands and your skin and your teeth. Not a record of your life, a record of how many people it took to make you and when. Think of it as a book that gets copied by hand, and every copy carries a few new mistakes. When there are a lot of scribes, you end up with a library full of slightly different versions, and you can see the whole spread of them. When almost all the scribes die, every copy after that is made from the 2 or 3 books that survived. The library gets rebuilt, but it is all descended from those few, and the variety never comes back. So a crash does not leave a document or a bone. It leaves a thinning. A stretch where the family tree goes narrow like a wasp waist before it opens out again. Their method found one, and it was enormous. By their estimate, around 930,000 years ago, the line that would eventually become us dropped to about 1,280 breeding adults, and stayed there for 117,000 years. Sit with the second number, because the first one is the one people quote, and the second one is the one that should frighten you. 117,000 years is not an event. It is not a winter or a drought or a war or anything with a beginning and an end that somebody could have lived through and described. Our own species, the anatomically modern kind, has been on this planet for about 300,000 years, so this was a lid held down on our ancestors for well over a third of that again before we existed at all. Picture the same stretch of ground for all of it, the same river, the same hills. Fires lit in the same places by people who never had any idea they were the last of anything, because as far as they could tell, there had always been about this many of them, and there always would be. 1,280 breeding adults is a small town. It is a large secondary school. It is fewer people than work in one big office block, and for that entire stretch, that was the whole line. Try to picture the arithmetic of a group that size. Every face is a face you know. There is no second valley over the hill with strangers in it. No other camp carrying a skill yours has forgotten. Nobody to walk to when the water goes bad. If the only person left who knows how to strike a decent edge off a lump of flint falls in a river, that knowledge is gone, and the next generation is working with worse tools. A run of bad luck that would be a sad story in a population of millions is, in a population of 1,000, the end of the story. And they held on like that for a stretch of time you cannot really feel. Not a generation, not 100 generations. Something like 5,000 generations of people being born, living, and dying with the whole future of the species sitting in that one small crowd. By the same estimate, roughly 99 out of every 100 of our ancestors were gone. And here is the part that matters for everything that follows. Nobody found a battlefield. Nobody found a layer of bones. The only reason anybody knows to look at that window at all is the shape of the DNA in people who are alive now. Keep that in one sentence, because this whole story keeps coming back to it. A disaster does not leave a body, it leaves a layer. Now come forward, a very long way, to a gap you personally came through. For most of the time humans have existed, we were an African species and nothing else. Then, somewhere between 50 and 70,000 years ago, a group walked out along the coast and kept going. Not a migration of millions, not a column of people stretching to the horizon. The founding group behind everyone alive today outside Africa is usually estimated at somewhere between 1 and 3,000 breeding adults, which is a stretch of beach with a few hundred cooking fires on it. You can still see it. If you take two people from different parts of Africa and compare their DNA, you will typically find more variety between those two than between a person from Norway and a person from Japan. Everybody outside Africa is working from a smaller starting deck because everybody outside Africa came through the same narrow doorway. They also picked something up on the way. If your ancestry is not entirely African, you are carrying roughly 2% Neanderthal DNA right now from encounters somewhere in the region of 50,000 years ago. Now this one is worth being careful about because it is a bottleneck and not a near death. Africa was fine. The people who stayed were not in any danger, and their descendants carry the diversity to prove it. What narrowed was not the species. It was the group that left. But it tells you how thin these threads get. Every person in Europe, in Asia, in Australia, and in the Americas, every city and every crowd and every face in every one of them descends from a group you could seat in one football stadium and still have empty rows at the back. So, two crashes, and neither of them is the one you are thinking of. Because the one you are thinking of is a volcano. 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, a mountain called Toba erupted, and the scale of it is genuinely hard to hold in your head. It threw out somewhere near 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock and ash. It is one of the largest eruptions on this planet in the last 2 million years, and the ash from it is still sitting in the ground across India, thick enough to stand in. And the story attached to it is famous. The sun goes out. A volcanic winter grips the planet for years. Plants fail, animals die, and humanity is reduced to a few thousand desperate survivors scraping through in Africa, which is why we are all so closely related today. You have heard some version of it. It is in documentaries, it is in textbooks, it turns up in podcasts, and it is a genuinely brilliant story because it puts a single visible cause behind something that is otherwise very hard to picture. It is also not true. Here is how we know, and it is one of my favorite pieces of evidence in all of prehistory, because it does not require any clever mathematics at all. You just need a shovel and some patience. The ash from Toba is unmistakable. It is a distinct layer, chemically identifiable, sitting in the ground across an enormous area, and it was laid down in a geological instant. So it is a perfect line in the dirt. Anything below it is before the eruption. Anything above it is after. So archaeologists went and dug through it. At a site called Toba in India, at Jwalapuram, also in India, at Pinnacle Point on the coast of South Africa. They found stone tools directly underneath the ash. Then they found stone tools directly on top of the ash, made in the same style, using the same techniques, by people doing the same things in the same places. There is no gap. There is no collapse layer, no abandonment, no sudden change in how anybody lived. You can watch a population walk straight through the worst eruption in 2 million years and carry on napping the same tools on the other side. The ice agrees. Cores taken from Lake Malawi in East Africa, right where the survivors were supposedly clinging on, show no sign of a volcanic winter at all. If the sky over East Africa had gone out for years, that lake would have recorded it, and it did not. And the genetics agree too. When people go looking for a population crash at 74,000 years ago, they do not find one. The narrowing that gets pointed at is the doorway out of Africa, and that had nothing to do with a volcano. It is worth asking why the story was so convincing for so long, because the answer is not that anybody was being careless. It arrived at exactly the right moment. Geneticists had worked out that modern humans are strangely closely related, far more so than you would expect for a species spread across a planet, and they were looking for a reason. Volcanologists had just worked out how enormous Toba had been. The two findings were roughly the same age, and they fitted together beautifully. One number explained the other. That is the trap, and it has nothing to do with volcanoes. Two facts that sit next to each other feel like one fact with a cause in the middle. It took 30 years and a lot of digging to find out that the middle was empty. So the most famous near extinction in human history is a story about our resilience that got told as a story about our fragility. Those people did not scrape through Toba. They barely noticed it, which leaves an obvious question. If the volcano everybody knows about did not do it, what did? And the honest answer is that the real ones are smaller, stranger, and much better evidenced. They do not look like a film. They look like a bad stripe in a piece of ice, or a line in a tree ring, or a hole in the ground full of people. None of them ended us. Every single one of them is a demonstration of how the ending would work, if it ever came. Start in the year 536. There is no eruption in the historical record for it. Nobody wrote down a mountain exploding. What they wrote down was the sun. A Byzantine historian described the sun giving light without brightness, like the moon, for a whole year. In Ireland, the annals record a failure of bread. In China, there are accounts of snow in summer. For 18 months, a dry fog sat over Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, and summer temperatures dropped by somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 degrees. That does not sound like much until you remember that a harvest does not care how you feel about it. Crops need a certain number of warm days. Take those away, and the food simply is not there. It was the beginning of the coldest decade in about 2,300 years. And it was not finished. There was another eruption in 540 and another in 547. Then in 541 the plague arrived, the one named after the Emperor Justinian, and moved through a population that had already been hungry for 5 years. The historian Michael McCormick has called 536 the worst year to be alive. That is his phrase rather than a measurement, but when you lay the decade out, it is difficult to argue with him. We only know where the volcano was because of ice. A core drilled out of a Swiss glacier carried tiny particles of volcanic glass, and their chemistry pointed toward Iceland. Probably. Some volcanologists still argue for North America. A disaster does not leave a body. It leaves a layer, which brings us to the strangest piece of detective work on this list. If you drill a core out of the ice in Greenland and another out of the ice in Antarctica, and line them up, you can read the atmosphere going back thousands of years. A big eruption throws sulfur high enough to spread across the whole planet, and it settles out at both poles, leaving the same spike at the same moment in two places 10,000 miles apart. In both cores, at the depth that corresponds to the year 1257, there is a band of sulfur so heavy it is one of the largest of the last several thousand years. You can see it in the ice with your eyes. Bigger than Tambor Ah, bigger than Krakatoa. And for decades, nobody could find the volcano. The signal was enormous and the crime scene was missing, which is an unusual problem to have because a mountain that size does not simply vanish. It took until 2013. A team matched the chemistry in the ice to a caldera on the island of Lombok in Indonesia called Samalas, and finally had a name for it. Meanwhile, in London, archaeologists had been digging up the cemetery at Spitalfields and finding something they could not explain. Mass graves. Thousands of bodies laid in rows, far too many for the ordinary business of dying, and dating from the wrong period for any plague anybody knew about. They line up with the famine years that followed the eruption nobody had found yet. That is the whole thing in one picture. A stripe in Greenland, a stripe in Antarctica, and a pit in East London. And it took the better part of a century to work out they were the same event. The one everybody has heard of came 90 years later. The Black Death reached Europe in 1347 and burned through it in about 4 years, and the numbers are genuinely difficult to write down. Serious estimates run from about 30% of the population to about 60. 50 million people is a figure that gets used. But the more interesting finding is recent, and it complicates the picture in a way that makes it more real rather than less. Researchers went and looked at pollen because farmed land and abandoned land grow different things. If half of everybody dies, fields go back to weeds and woodland, and the pollen record shows it. What they found is that the dying was wildly uneven. Some regions collapsed almost completely. Others carried on farming as though very little had happened, which is worth holding on to because a species does not die evenly either. It dies in the places where things were already fragile. Then, in 1815, Mount Tambor Ah, also in Indonesia, produced the largest eruption in recorded history. About 100 cubic kilometers of material. Around 10,000 people killed by the eruption itself, and something like 100,000 or more once famine and disease had worked through the region. The following year has a name. 1816 is the year without a summer. Snow fell in New England in June. Harvests failed across Europe. In Switzerland, a group of writers stuck indoors by relentless rain agreed to pass the time with ghost stories, and one of them wrote Frankenstein. The global temperature drop was modest, somewhere around half a degree, which is the point worth taking from it. Half a degree, spread across a planet, was enough to take away a harvest across 2 continents. So, ash, ice, graves, tree rings, pollen. Every one of these left a layer, and now the one that did not. In the last decade, geneticists comparing men and women found something that made no sense at first. The DNA passed down the female line, from mother to daughter, looks the way you would expect. Diverse, deep, full of variety, going back a long way. The Y chromosome, which passes from father to son, does not. Starting somewhere around 7,000 years ago and running for about 2,000 years, the male line in populations across Europe, Asia, and Africa collapses. Not the number of men. The number of men who left descendants. At the bottom of it, the diversity of the male line is what you would expect if roughly 1 man was reproducing for every 17 women. Read that again because it is easy to skim. Women were fine. The female half of the tree carried on. It is only the fathers who vanish, and they vanish almost everywhere at once over 2,000 years. There is no ash layer for this, no ice spike, no famine in the annals, no mass grave anybody has dug up. It is not written in the ground at all. The only place it exists is inside men who are alive today. So what does that? Not a volcano, because a volcano does not check anybody's sex. Not a plague, for the same reason. Not a famine. The leading explanation is us. By 7,000 years ago, people had begun organizing themselves into clans that traced descent through the father. Your line, your land, your cattle, and your name came down the male side. And clans like that fight, and when they lose, they do not lose an individual. They lose the entire male line at once, all the way down, every son and every grandson who would have existed. Kill 1 man in a foraging band, and you remove 1 man. Destroy a patrilineal clan, and you delete a whole branch of the tree, permanently, including every son who was never born and every grandson after him. And the women were not deleted with them. That is the detail that gives the whole thing away. If a village had been wiped out, mothers and fathers would disappear together and both halves of the record would thin at once. They do not. The female line keeps going, which means the women were being absorbed into whoever won. Do that for 2,000 years across 3 continents and you get exactly the genome we are carrying. Notice what this one does not have. There is no year for it. There is no place you can visit. Nobody wrote it down because the people doing it did not know they were doing anything, and each individual episode was just a raid, or a feud, or a bad season between neighbors. It is only visible from a very long way back when you line up millions of men and notice how few grandfathers they share. This is the closest thing on the list to a self-inflicted wound, and it is the only one where the cause is not weather. It is also the one that should bother you most. Every other item here needed the planet to do something. A mountain to open, an ocean current to stall, a bacterium to get into a flea. This one needed nothing but men with ordinary weapons doing what they already thought was normal. Which brings us, finally, to the 26th of September, 1983, and a bunker south of Moscow called Serpukhov 15. The Soviet Union had a satellite system watching American missile fields. Just after midnight, it reported a launch. Then another, then a total of 5 coming in. The officer on duty was Stanislav Petrov, and his job was to pass what the screen said up the chain. He had minutes, he did report it. This is the part that usually gets told wrong. He picked up the phone and he called it in. But he called it in as a system malfunction rather than as an incoming attack, and he did that while the alarm was still going and the screen still said 5. His reasoning was that it made no sense. A real first strike would not be 5 missiles. It would be hundreds, because anything less hands your enemy an intact arsenal and a reason to use it. And the ground radar, which should have confirmed anything real, was showing nothing at all. He was right. Sunlight had caught the tops of high-altitude clouds at an unusual angle, in a rare alignment between the satellite, the cloud, and the sun, and the system had read the glint as fire. It is worth staying in that room for a moment, because the pressure in it is the whole point. He was not a general, and he was not making policy. He was a duty officer with a screen in front of him that said the highest confidence the system could give, an alarm going off, and a written procedure telling him exactly what to do. The correct action on paper was to pass it on. Everybody above him would then have had a few minutes working from what he sent, and no way to check it. It is worth being careful about what this does and does not mean. Soviet doctrine required corroboration before a launch, and the radar never gave it, so there is a serious argument that nothing would have happened even if Petrov had passed it up as real. What makes it land anyway is when it happened. 3 weeks earlier, a Soviet fighter had shot down a Korean airliner with 269 people on board, and both sides were as close to expecting the worst as they ever got. The nearest we have come to ending ourselves on purpose ran through one man deciding that a screen was wrong. So, how close did we come? Closer than the story you started with, and never in the way that story tells it. Not once by a mountain, twice by something in the climate that we can only see because it left a mark in ice or in a ring of wood. Once, for 117,000 years, by something we cannot identify at all, which we only know about because it thinned the blood of everybody reading this. And once, for 2,000 years, by ourselves. A disaster does not leave a body. It leaves a layer. There are about 8 billion of us now, which is more people than have ever been alive at one time, and it feels permanent in a way that 1,000 people in a valley never could. But everything on this list felt permanent too, right up until the summer that did not arrive. Somewhere above us, a stripe is already forming. Somebody will drill down through it one day and read what we were doing. The only question is what they find in it.